पढ़ने वाले हैं, I normally say when they come from far away. Yeah, I used to study in Bury. Well, not exactly Bury, but it's Ramsbottom. Weird place. You, Amin Mullah's niece? No? No, it's not your... Okay, sorry. I just thought that you're from Bolton, you probably came together. Yeah. I just put two and two together, but sorry. I'll decouple you. So Bilal Sahib, are we ready? Yeah. Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمدا طيبا كثيرا مباركا فيه مباركا عليه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى جل جلاله وعم نواله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الحبيب المصطفى وعلى آله وأصحابه نجوم الهدى قادة التقى أما بعد. So welcome everyone. We meet in flesh and blood, as the Arabs say, في اللحم والشحم, right? في اللحم والشحم basically means in flesh and fat. But that's what it means, but in Arabic that's how they say في اللحم والشحم, flesh and blood. I just thought that it'll be nice for us to meet, because most likely, at least for this book, I don't know what Bilal has in store for me after this book finishes, but at least for this book, most likely this may be the only time that we meet, because I live in physically I live in Cardiff, so it's quite difficult for me to travel. Although Bilal originally wanted me to travel like every month once, but it's difficult with children and things like that. So, and I don't like the trek. It's too long. Okay, so let's start. Page 77. Al-Hasan li dhatihi. Zain Sab, can you read? Yeah. Is the mic gonna pick him up though, or shall I read? If Zain Sab reads. Okay, shall I just read then? Is that okay? So page 77. Al-Hasan li dhatihi. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فإن خف الضبط أي قل يقال خف القوم خفوفا قلوا. And if the academic ability is less, فإن خف الضبط, if the academic ability is less, أي قل, and what he's given a translation of what khaffa means lower, ay qalla, i.e. less, yuqalu, it is said khaffa al-qawmu khufufan, that the people have thinned, or the people have lessened. Qallu, ay, people have lessened. So he's given you the nuances of the word khaffa. والمراد, and what that basically means is مع بقية الشروط المتقدمة في حد الصحيح. What that basically means is in addition to the previously mentioned conditions for the sahih. فهو الحسن لذاته, that hadith is hasan, or inherently hasan لذاته. So what is the definition of hasan لذاته? Very simple definition. فإن خف الضبط, yeah, إن خف الضبط, that is the definition. إن خف الضبط, if the academic ability is less, right, with the condition مع بقية شروط الصحة المتقدمة. Okay, out of the 5 conditions of a sahih hadith, what are the five conditions? عدالة الراوي, yeah, ضبط الراوي, اتصال السند, عدم الشذوذ, عدم العلة. Okay, the probity of the narrator, the character of the narrator, عدالة الراوي, ضبط الراوي, the rawi's academic ability, اتصال السند, the sanad, the isnad being unbroken, عدم الشذوذ, there is no anomaly in the hadith, وعدم العلة, and there is no hidden defects in the hadith. If those 5 conditions are found in a hadith, then that hadith is deemed as sahih. What is the definition of a Hasan hadith? That there is a problem with one of those definitions, and that is فَإِنْ خَفَّ الضَّبْطِ. If the narrator falls below the narrator of the Sahih as far as academic ability is concerned, okay, then that hadith is Hasan lidhatihi, as long as all of the other conditions are maintained. Right? Why? Because فَإِنْ خَفَّ الْعَدَالَةِ, if the narrator falls, or there is a defect in adala, in his character, then that won't render the hadith hasan, it'll render it straight away weak. Okay? It'll render the hadith weak. If there is a break in the isnad, okay, that will render the hadith weak. If the hadith is anomalous, if the hadith is shaz, that will render the hadith weak. Okay, so the other four conditions need to be maintained. It's just that the narrator falls slightly below the level of a sahih hadith. Does that make sense? Yep. So we come to the discussion of Hasan hadith. Hasan hadith is, as Imam al-Khattabi says, Hasan hadith are the hadiths which are the most. Most of the ahadith are Hasan. In comparison to Sahih, there are more Hasan hadith. Okay? And the reason why is because the conditions of Sahih are sometimes too stringent to fulfill. Most of Islamic law, Imam al-Khattabi says, وَعَلَيْهِ مَدَارُ الْأَحَادِيثِ فِي السُّنَنِ. Most of the ahadith related to Islamic law fall in the category of Hasan. Okay? And the madhan, the source of Hasan hadith, the main source of Hasan hadith are the Sunan al-Arba'a, yeah, Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan ibn Majah, Sunan al-Nasa'i, Sunan Abi Dawood. Please do ask questions if you don't understand something. You got me live. Okay, so most of the Hasan hadith, their source is the Sunan al-Arba'a, or the four Sunan books. Okay, but the bulk of Islamic law comes from the Hasan hadith, because the Sahih in compared to Hasan is less. Okay, so many times what we find is in the Sahih al-Bukhari, Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi alayhi uses chapter headings. Okay, chapter headings like chapter of Salat and chapter of so and so, and the chapter headings, the title of the chapter headings are actually hadiths, actual hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they fall below the condition of a sahih hadith, and therefore Imam Bukhari does not include them as a hadith in his book, but he uses the wordings as a chapter heading. Okay, if I was to give you an example of that, if I can find an example. I'll give you an example of how Imam Bukhari (195). If you have any questions, please do ask. Yes.
So is it possible for a narrator whose narration is become Hasan, can he have a Sahih narration, totally different hadith, and that be Sahih, or is it once the narrator has been his narration being classed as Hassan, it has to always be Hassan.
Yeah,
It has to always be Hassan.
yeah. Because remember that a, an isnad. Okay, so we have a hadith. Okay, I think I need to explain this because it gets a bit confusing sometimes. Can everybody see this? Right, we have a hadith. Okay, a hadith is, and these are all isnads. Okay, different isnads coming out of a hadith. One isnad, two isnad, three isnad, four isnad. Okay, the hadith is basically the sum of the isnad, and this is the matan. Yeah, the text of the hadith. The hadith is the sum of the isnad and the matan. All of this together makes a hadith. Okay, but like I mentioned, that the word hadith sometimes is used differently. Okay, so for example, if there is a rawi here who is known as the madar of the isnad, Abu Ishaq. Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i. Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, right? He's a famous rawi, and he normally comes as a what we call a common link, right? So CL, we call it CL, common link, and in Arabic is known as madar, the person on whom the isnad pivots on, right? Now, if Abu Ishaq is the madar of all of these isnads, what that basically means is that every single isnad they join on Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, then we might refer to this hadith as the hadith of Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i. Yeah? The hadith of Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i. Because Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i is the person who is the madar of the isnad, all of the isnads join. Okay? Now, if there is, if we want to now distinguish between particular isnad strands, right? This isnad strand might have been narrated by Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i from his son Israel ibn Abi Ishaq, from his father Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i. This particular isnad might have been narrated from Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i by Yunus. Okay, now if I want to kind of refer to a particular isnad strand, I might refer it to the isnad of, or the hadith of Israel, okay, or the hadith of Yunus. Now we all know this matan. Okay, if this matan was let's say al-istinja bil hajarain, this is in Tirmizi. Istinja bil hajarain. Al-istinja bil hajarain, doing istinja with two stones. Okay, so narrated by Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As. The pivot of the hadith is Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i. There's a number of isnad strands coming out of this. The narration of Israel is in Tirmidhi. The narration of Yunus is in Bukhari. Right? Now, we are looking into these isnads. If I want to refer to the isnad of Imam Bukhari, I might call it the isnad of Imam Bukhari. But the problem is that Imam Bukhari might have a number of isnads for that same hadith. Imam Bukhari doesn't very rarely has, not very seldom has that, but Imam Muslim will have a lot of isnads together. So how we identify a particular isnad strand is either by the common link, or if we are looking at a particular isnad and we want to research it, then we refer it to the person who's narrating it from the common link. So this is known as the hadith of Yunus and Abi Ishaq. This is known as the hadith of Israel and Abi Ishaq. Yeah. So these are the different ways that the word hadith is mentioned. Just giving you an example of ilal.
So how, you know, if a person's thought is weak,
Yeah.
one narrator, how many hadith matans does it take to determine him to be weak in his thought? So if there was one hadith, and in that one hadith his accuracy was less than the other isnads that were in there, the other narrators.
Okay, so good question. How many hadiths does it take in order to be able to ascertain whether somebody is weak or not? Oh, sorry, I forgot why I mentioned this, right? So the hadith, okay, the judgment on the actual matan of the hadith will be judged according to the strongest isnad. Okay, the strongest isnad in this hadith or in this matan is this one of Bukhari. Okay, this one of Bukhari. So because this is a strong isnad, we will say that this hadith is sahih. Okay, the individual isnads are determined according to the weakest narrator, the weakest link. Okay, so the individual isnads are dependent on the weakest narrator. The actual hadith, the matan of the hadith, is dependent on the strongest isnad. Yeah, and this is why we find it's easier to actually give a hukum, declare that a particular isnad is weak or a particular isnad is strong, as opposed to declaring that a hadith is weak or a hadith is strong. Okay, so for example, Imam Nuruddin al-Haythami does that quite a lot in Majmu' al-Zawaid. He says, هذا الحديث صحيح الإسناد. Okay, now normally when the hadith is sahih al-isnad, okay, the hadith is sahih. But it's when we look at a da'if isnad, a weak isnad, we might not know that there is a sahih isnad for the hadith. So rather than saying that this is a weak hadith, we say that this is a hadith, or this isnad of the hadith is weak. Imam Nuruddin Haythami says, هذا hadith ضعيف الإسناد. That particular matan that he's got, this isnad he's got appended to it, is weak. Yeah. Yes.
You have one matan and you have one sahih isnad, for example, given a certain detail. Let's say it's a number, 20 for example, and that's the sahih one. But all the, let's say, weak ones, let's say mention 25.
Yeah.
Do you look at the sahih one, or because of the multitude of the weak and all the weaks are corresponding, do you look at the weak one or weak ones together?
Okay, so this is something that we're going to study today, Ma'ruf and Munkar. So we'll wait for it then. Okay. Yeah. So we'll wait for it then. Okay, when it comes. One of the things that you'll realize is that analyzing isnads, okay, and determining a hadith is both qualitative and quantitative. Sometimes you use qualitative measures, okay, like looking into somebody's academic credentials and things like that to ascertain. And sometimes it is a numbers game, okay, ta'addud al-turuq and things like that. Now, one of the things is that, Brother Zain asked, how many narrations or how many narrators or how many hadiths do you need before you declare somebody to be Hasan or Da'if or Sahih? Now, fortunately for us, that work has already been done. So we don't need to do that. Okay? Which scholar is weak and which rawi is strong and Hasan and all of that, that's all been done for us by the likes of Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmizi. We don't need to do that. Okay? But what they've done is they've taken each individual narrator, okay, let's say they've taken Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, okay, and they would look at every single narrations of Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i and compare Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i's narration to all of the others in his class, and compare how much he deviates from his classmates. Okay, and then according to that deviation, yeah, you will they will give a standard hukum. Now, if you actually look at some modern studies of hadith, you will actually find people who have done studies on hadith using statistical analysis and probabilities, mathematical probabilities. People have actually done that. So there's a whole website on this where they're actually doing hadith analysis on the basis of probabilities, okay, frequencies and things like that. The problem is, and on the basis of that, they're kind of giving hukum of hadith. So for example, hukum of should women wear hijab or not, and then their analysis was that women don't need to wear hijab according to the hadith, based on probabilities, mathematical, statistical analysis of the isnad. The problem is that it's not only about probability, there's a qualitative aspect to it. Okay, you have to actually go into the narrator, look into their lives, what kind of weakness is it. Sometimes, so somebody might declare somebody weak, okay, but that weakness might not be such that this person he might be discarded from hadith related to law, but that weakness is not so weak that he's discarded from hadiths from fadail. That weakness is not so much that you can actually use him in law as a secondary corroboratory evidence. So just because somebody is weak, you don't just kind of write him off straight away. There is a qualitative element to that. But fortunately for us, this hukum of who's weak, who's not, that's all been done for us. In fact, most of the takhrij has been done for us. Most of the hukum of the hadith has been done for us. So we don't really need to kind of go and reinvent the cycle. The only one of the reasons why we study usul al-hadith and things like that is to kind of understand when let's say Imam Bukhari, or let's say let's not say Imam Bukhari, let's say Suyuti, okay, Imam Suyuti, why he declared a particular hadith sahih, or why he declared a particular hadith da'if, for us to understand his mind, for us to understand why he arrived at that ruling, rather than us trying to do the ruling ourselves. Yeah, unless you are going into manuscripts which are hitherto not published, yeah, the chances are that you won't actually need to do isnad analysis yourself, unless you're writing a PhD thesis or something like that, or you're writing a paper and you're trying to explain, let's say for example, hadith in Sunan Tirmizi, Amir al-Sha'bi narrates that that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam qala amin wa khafada sawtahu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said amin and he lowered his voice. Okay, this is the Hanafi position, where we don't say amin loudly. But the same narrator, Ash-Sha'bi, also narrates, and Rasulullah qala amin wa madda sawtahu, and the Prophet said amin and he raised his voice. So Sha'bi is the madaris, the common link, and there are students narrating from him. Two students narrate from him that he lowered his voice. Two students narrate from him that he raised his voice. And that's why we get the difference. Some people say Ameen loudly in prayer, and the Hanafis say Ameen quietly. Now, how do you reconcile between those two hadiths? Okay, then you basically go and do isnad analysis on them. Unless it's a kind of a manuscript that's not been published, I don't know, something like Sunan Ibn al-Jarud or something like that, that's not been published, and now you're working on it, and there are some hadiths in there which is not found in any other books of hadith, then you might need to do original isnad analysis. But most likely you won't need to do original isnad analysis. But the reason why we teach usul al-hadith is so that you may recognize the processes that is involved, and you may recognize how the alim or the ulama, they arrived at a particular decision. You will find sometimes ulama are giving two different hukms for the same hadith. Okay, so for example, the hadith which is man hafiza ala ummati arba'ina hadithan min amri dinihim. Okay, man hafiza ala ummati arba'ina hadithan min dinihim jara Allahu ala lisanihi yanabi' hikam or ba'ath Allahu yawm al-qiyamati min zumarat al-fuqaha. That whoever learns 40 hadith, okay, from this deen, then and acts upon it, then on the day of judgment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will resurrect them with the fuqaha. Okay, this is the famous hadith which motivates everyone to write 40 hadiths. Imam Nawawi's 40 hadiths, Mullah Ali's 40 hadiths, Ibn Hajar's 40 hadiths, Ibn Asakir's 40 hadiths, Imam Suyuti's 40 hadiths. Right? This is the hadith which motivates us to study Imam Nawawi's 40 hadiths. Imam al-Nawawi himself actually discusses this hadith, Man hafidha ala ummati arba'ina hadithan, in his book, in the muqaddimah of the 40 hadiths, and he declares this hadith to be weak. He declares this hadith to be weak. And it's probably because the ulama are quite scrupulous in trying to follow the words of the Prophet ﷺ that Imam Nawawi actually does not have 40 hadiths strictly, he has 42 hadiths or 43 hadiths. Imam Ibn Hajar in his Al-Imta, which is his 40 hadiths, doesn't have 40 hadiths, he has 45 hadiths. Yeah? But Imam Nawawi declares this hadith to be weak. Imam Abu Tahir as-Silafi declares this hadith to be Hasan li-ghayrihi. Now we have two scholars, An-Nawawi and then Abu Tahir as-Silafi, both great muhaddith. One is basically saying this hadith is weak, and the other one is saying that this hadith is Hasan. How do they arrive at two different conclusions? Because they were looking at it from two different points. Imam Nawawi was just looking at it from the point of view of individual isnads, and he's basically saying that all the isnads are weak and therefore the hadith is weak. Imam Abu Tahir as-Silafi is collectively looking at the isnads and then saying that collectively there's so many weak isnads that it gets bumped up to the level of Hasan li ghayrihi. And both of them are correct. Okay? But they're just looking at it from different perspectives. Yes?
Is this the concept of Hassan? Is it a later concept or is it an early concept?
Okay. What do you think? So is the concept of Hasan, is it a later concept or is it earlier concept?
It seems later
Why do you say that?
because they probably, well, I've heard that they just used to regard it as
Say that again.
they used to regard it as
So when you say early and when you say late, give me a time limit.
Imam Hanbal's time.
Yeah.
He must have just been weak or authentic. Like when the latest one, like Ibn Hajar, they also done like Hassan, what are these other concepts?
No, Imam Tirmidhi uses the word Hasan. Imam Tirmidhi was very early. He's known as the Mutaqaddimin.
So, I mean, early in the sense of, so it was a concept developed in the later stages of hadith analysis, whereas at the early stages it was just weak or.
Well, I'm saying Imam Tirmidhi, he's a very early scholar. He's a student of Bukhari.
I'm talking about Tabi'in and stuff. Like they must have just said it's weak or it's. They must have not had loads.
One of the interesting things is the Tabi'ins, they don't declare hadiths and things like that to be weak, or they have different terminologies. So if you study Muhaddith al-Fasil by Ram Hurumzi, you won't find all this Sahih, Da'if and all that. They'll basically say something like Ma'ruf al-Hadith or Hasan al-Hadith or Thiqat al-Hadith. They have a complete different terminology. Yeah, but you're right. Hasan is. I'm just trying to gauge how much you know on the topic. Hasan is a later development. Have you read my PhD thesis? No. So it's on that group. My PhD thesis was on the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, and there is an entire chapter in that dedicated to Hasan Hadith. I normally say to people that, I started my PhD in 2005, finished in 2009. I say to people, when I started my PhD, I kind of understood what Hasan Hadith was, or I knew what Hasan Hadith was. By the time I finished my PhD, I confused myself. I have no idea what Hasan Hadith is. I completely confused myself. Right, but you're right. Hasan is, to a certain extent, is a later development. When Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal used to only have two categories. He used to have Sahih and he used to have Da'if. Okay, which is quite easy, because if you have Sahih and then you have Da'if, then there is quite there is a marked limit between what is deemed to be acceptable and what is deemed to be not acceptable. There's a marked difference between them. Okay, asman zamin farq hai. Yeah, but when you put in something in the middle, which from one angle looks like it's da'if and from one angle it looks like it's sahih, then that makes it problematic. It makes it problematic because some people will see it as weak and some people will see it as sahih. Okay, because then what happens is that you don't have that exact difference between them. You have this kebab mein haddi in the middle, right, where people can't really define how it is. It's like you've got daytime, you've got nighttime, and then in the middle, what do you have? What's in between day and night? Hey, you got twilight. Yeah, you have twilight, and now twilight, it basically causes all of these problems. Causes all of these problems related to Isha prayer, causes all of these problems related to Fajr prayer. It was easier when we just said we've got night and day. So similarly, it was easier when you say either all of these narrators are sahih or all of these narrators are da'if. Bringing in another qualification in the middle, that is, it's problematic. Okay, but nevertheless, the ulama did realize that actually it's not black and white. There are nuances. It's like when you ask. I'll give you an example. It's like when you talk to Shafi'is and you're talking to them about witr, and for them witr is sunnat mu'akkada, yeah, and you say, but is the witr sunnah mu'akkada exactly the same as the sunnah mu'akkada of dhuhr prayer, the 2 rakat of the dhuhr prayer? They'll say no, it's a bit different. The witr sunnah mu'akkada is more mu'akkad, it's more emphasized, yeah, it's mu'akkad ala al-mu'akkad. So it's sunnah mu'akkada, but it's a bit more emphasized than the zuhr sunnah. That the Hanafis basically say is what we declare as wajib. So the Hanafis put in another terminology because they have noticed that within the sunnah mu'akkada and within the fard, there are some which are lesser degree in than the fard, but higher than the sunnah mu'akkada. And to put them in either categories is problematic. So they developed a new category called wajib. Similarly, the later muhaddithun, they saw that it's actually quite problematic in the sense of saying just sahih or da'if. It's not black and white, there are nuances. That's why they developed the terminology hasan. The term hasan was used previously, but in a different way. For example, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i uses the word hasan to mean gharib, lone isnads. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah argues that before At-Tirmidhi, nobody actually used the term hasan, but Imam Tirmidhi was the only one that used it according to the Mutaqaddimun, and then later it was Al-Khattabi who came a few hundred years later. He was the first one to use the terminology hasan, and then from him onwards it became quite famous, to the extent that now we don't only have hasan, we have two hasans, hasan li zatihi, hasan li ghayrihi. Yep. Is that okay? Any questions from the sisters? Is everyone sometimes that when I'm teaching you on Zoom, I really don't know if people are understanding me or not. I mean, obviously fiqh, right, is a subject. You're talking about wudu and you're talking about hajj and zakat, and there is a practical element to that, and everybody, you understand it or you don't understand it, but there's a practical element. But this topic, I'm not sure if people are really understanding, or are they nodding their head. So the sisters, are you understanding? Because I might just test you and say, explain back to me. Yes. From a Hasan hadith. Yeah, so that's coming in the text. Yeah. Do you understand what's happening, or is it okay? Okay. Imam al-Mizzi, Imam Yusuf Jamaluddin al-Mizzi, who was a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he was from the later Mamluk scholars. He was one of the greatest. Al-Mizzi is the one who wrote the Tahdhib or Sharh Tahdhib al-Kamal, the massive 35 volume on Asma al-Rijal. He's wrote a book called Tuhfatul Ashraf. Okay, Tuhfatul Ashraf is a book written by Jamaluddin Mizzi. I mean, it's a book where what he's doing is it's called Atraf. Tuhfatul Ashraf fi ma'arifatil Atraf. Atraf, alif ta ra alif lam alif fa, atraf, from the word tarf, basically means kinara. Kinara means aside. Atraf is just the first few words of a hadith. Okay, so you have these books called Kitabul Atraf. Nowadays we've got Google and you've got Shamila and others where we just type in and the hadith comes up. But before, they used to have these books of Atraf. So they will have all the hadith that starts with inna, right? All, it's like a dictionary, all put together in inna Allah qala or inna Rasulullah qala. So these are called Atraf. So then you go to these books and find out where that hadith is. Okay. Imam Mizzi wrote a book called Tuhfatul Ashraf, where he's done an atraf of all the isnads of the 6 books. So if we were to look at Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, then he will give you all of the isnads in the 6 books where Abu Ishaq comes and who narrated from him. So it's a good way of kind of comparing isnads. Imam Yusuf al-Mizzi, and there's one person who's, sorry, this is just a sidetrack. There's one person who actually, for more than 30 years, only studied the Tuhfatul Ashraf of Imam Mizzi. It's a non-Muslim scholar by the name of Gautier Yombol. He died in 2012. He developed his own Usulul Hadith. He developed his own. He wasn't a Muslim, he was a historian, and for him hadith was about history, tracing the history. And Yombol developed his own usul hadith, so common links, and then he calls them spiders and dives, and he's got this. It's quite elaborate, quite fascinating. But he studied Imam Mizzi's work for 30 years, Tuhfatul Ashraf, and he's got his own notes on there. So when he died in 2012, he donated his book to Leiden University Library, and it's before he actually died, Yombol, he wrote a book called an Encyclopedia of Canonical Hadith Collection, right? Encyclopedia is a massive encyclopedia of canonical hadith collection, and he's basically done a hukum of every single hadith of the book of the Sihah Sitta, based on Mizzi's Tuhfatul Ashraf, but also his own kind of methodology of common links, dives, isnads. So a chapter of my master's thesis was dedicated to him. He's basically saying that all of the hadiths are weak. Every single hadith of the Kutub al-Sitta, according to his methodology, it's weak. But nevertheless, but he did study Mizzi for 30 years. He had his own agenda. He came from a very scholarly background. His father, whose name also was T.A. Yombol, was one of the first to translate Sahih al-Bukhari into German. But Yombal didn't die a very good death. He's actually, one of my grand teachers, my PhD supervisor's PhD supervisor. Yombal came from a very rich family. He became very disorientated with academia, so he left university and started his own kind of research institute. And his research institute was just him. And for 30 years, he just studied hadith. He came out with fascinating stuff. He's written many stuff on hadith. Like I said, he wrote an own encyclopedia. But he didn't marry, so he had no children. He had no wife. So his work were his children. And he became very agitated towards the end of his life. And anybody who criticized his works, he kind of fell out with them. So he had a friend, again a Dutch scholar by the name of Harold Motzki. Harold Motzki also died, I think, in 2015. I was in correspondence with Harold Motzki when I was doing my PhD. Wallahu alam, I heard that Harold Motzki became a Muslim later on in life, just before he died. But Harold Motzki, he developed, again, he was a hadith scholar. These non-Muslims, they're studying these. I mean, if you go into academia, you'll be fascinated the type of stuff that they study. So Harold Motzki, he studied his original work was studying the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq. So he did a detailed study of the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, and through his detailed study of the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, he proved that the Orientalists before him, like Goldziya and Shacht, who said that all of the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ are bakwas and they don't actually go back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. There are later development from the Abbasid period. So it's the Abbasids who made those hadiths and then put it back into the mouth of the Prophet for their own reasons. So he, doing a detailed analysis of the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, he proved actually that the hadiths can go back to the Prophet ﷺ. One is that we are saying, حدثنا 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 قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. But then, we have our own methodology of ascertaining whether it goes back to the Prophet ﷺ or not. They have their own methodology. And using their own methodology of biblical criticism, Harold Motzki basically said that yes, we can prove that even from Western methodology, the hadith goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. Do you remember we were talking about the isnad an Amr ibn Shu'ayb an Abihi and Jaddihi, which is the Sahifa Sadiqa, Sayyidina Amr ibn As, he wrote this. It was Harold Motzki who discovered the entire book in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. Anyway, Harold Motzki, he disproved all of Yombal's work. They were friends, right? But he showed that there's major methodological flaws in Yombal's work, and he exposed those methodologies. Yombal didn't take very nicely to that and cut friendship with him, so they became academic rivals. But Yombal, basically, he died back in 2012, and people who knew him first had experience Riwayat al-Muttasil. They told me that he was just sitting on his sofa just waiting to die. He was depressed. Obviously he was too old, he couldn't see properly to study further, and he was just literally sitting just waiting to die on his sofa, just like that. And that's how he actually died. He was very depressed, no family, no nothing. Wallahu alam. But anyway, that's just a side. I was mentioning Imam Mizzi. Imam Mizzi rahmatullahi alayhi, he defines Hasan hadith, and he says the Hasan hadith is the narrator who some people have declared the narrator to be weak, and some people have declared the narrator to be strong. However, the ones who've declared him to be weak did not tell us why he's weak. Yeah? Al-Jarh Mubham. They just said he's weak. Okay? So then this then opens up another door. Sometimes, yeah, you might get a narrator who is declared weak, by the ulama or by one scholar. But they didn't tell us why. For whatever reason they forgot, or they just didn't tell us why he is weak. Now this is known as jarh mubham, okay, undisclosed criticism, as opposed to jarh mufassar, expanded or explained or disclosed criticism. When you have a narrator where the jarh, the criticism of that narrator is undisclosed, then there is a leeway here, because the research on this scholar is not complete. Yeah, there is still stuff that requires wanting. The research is not complete. So then somebody else might come and then they say, okay, let's look at this narrator, and then they might come to the conclusion, actually no, that criticism is unfounded, he's actually a sahih narrator. And somebody else might come and say, yeah, that criticism is founded, it has a basis, and he's a weak narrator. And then that, because two people have then elaborated on him differently, that will then have a effect on the hukum, okay, depending on if somebody sees him as weak, or depending on if somebody sees him. And that's why you have differences of opinion on the hadith as to if he's weak or if he's not weak, because of the ikhtilaf found in the narrators. Okay, so Mizzi basically says, in another word, Imam Jamaluddin Mizzi says that the Hasan hadith is where the narrator is what is known as masturul hal. Yeah. This is not permanent, is it?
No.
Seems permanent.
What is that?
You might need so you might have a narrator who is mashhur, mashhurul hal. Yeah. Mashhurul hal basically means that everybody knows his situation. Everybody knows who he is. Yeah. They know his adala, right, and they know his academic capability. Now, mashhurul hal, right, doesn't necessarily have to be a authentic narrator. It can be a weak narrator. It's just that everybody knows him. Yeah. Abdul Karim ibn Abil Mukhariq was a weak narrator, but he's mashhur. Everybody knows him. Mashhur in the literal sense. Everybody knows who he is. Yeah. Then you get something which is called majhulul hal. Majhul. Yeah. Majhul is the narrator where only one person has narrated from him. Only one person has narrated from him. You get books written on these, like who are majhul narrators. Only one person has narrated from him. In order for a person to be in the category of mashhur, at least two people have to narrate, okay, in order for somebody to basically be recognized. Majhul is where only one person has narrated from me, and therefore this person is majhul. This is a weakness, because then we don't have corroboration of what kind of person he is, what kind of a scholar he is. Then you have somebody which is mastur. Yeah, mastur, veiled. Mastur is the rawi who in a way is ambiguous, right? We don't know, we know who he is, but as far as his adala is concerned, we don't know if he's a weak narrator or if he is a authentic narrator, because the classification on him is mubham, right? Somebody declared him to be weak, but then didn't tell us why the person is weak, left it, yeah. And normally it's not a universal principle, but it's like a semi-universal principle. Normally, al-jarhu muqaddamun ala ta'dil. It's not a universal principle. It doesn't apply everywhere, but it's like a general principle that if you have a narrator, okay, and the narrator, people have declared, some people have said that this person is weak, and some person said that this people have said that this person is authentic narrator. Normally, you'll give preference to the weakness side and declare that person to be weak, because it's better to be safe than sorry. Okay, al-jarhu muqaddamun ala ta'dil. Jarh is privileged over adala, but that's when the jarh is what we call jarh mufassar. Mufassar means when people have elaborated the weakness and told us why that person, not when the jarh is mubham. So mastur is the person who we don't know there isn't a tarjih, we don't know if that person is weak or not, because there is no privileging. Okay, then you have another thing which is called mubham. Mubham is ambiguous. For example, in the isnad, if we have an rajulin, the word rajul, from a man, or an imra'atin, yeah, from a man or from a woman, but we don't know who that person is. Yeah, sometimes you get that, unless another strand or another version of the isnad tells us who that person is, right? Then that hadith will be declared weak, because it's mubham. We don't know who this person can be. Anybody. Yeah. Sometimes what we have is muhmal. Muhmal is where we cannot differentiate between two narrators. For example, if the word Sufyan comes, yeah, if the word Sufyan comes in the narration, yeah, now we don't know if that's Sufyan ibn Uyayna, or we don't know if that's Sufyan al-Thawri. Yeah, and we look at all of the different isnad strands, and we don't know which one it is. Now the chances are that you will be able to know which one it is, because if you look at the students narrating, and if you look at the teachers, then you will know, oh, this one studied from this, and this Shaykh is coming, so it must be Sufyan ibn Uyayna. Okay? But Sufyan ibn Uyayna and Sufyan ibn Thawri have the same teachers and have the same students. Yeah? But in this particular example, if the word Sufyan does come, and if it's Sufyan ibn Uyayna or Sufyan al-Thawri, it really doesn't matter. And the reason why it doesn't matter is because both of them are authentic narrators. Both of them narrate from the same teachers and narrate to the same students. It doesn't really matter. Yeah? But imagine you have got somebody like Hammad or someone else from the same teachers. If it's different teachers and different students, then you'll be able to differentiate, right? But if it's from the same teachers and same students, but one of them is weak and one of them is not weak, then it becomes problematic. Yeah? So this is called muhmal. So these are the different types of classifications of narrators.
You had Majhul al-Hal.
Yeah.
Is Majhul al-Ain when there's nobody narrating?
Yeah, Majhulul Ain. Bilal Sab, tell me when we need to break.
Whenever you feel like.
Okay, let's do this definition. You start back from the Al-Hasan li-dhatihi. فَإِنْ خَفَّ الضَّبْطُ Hasan li-dhatihi فَإِنْ خَفَّ الضَّبْطُ. If the academic ability is lowered أي قل, i.e. it's lessened, يقال خف القوم خفوفا قلوا, والمراد مع بقية الشروط المتقدمة في حد الصحيح فهو الحسن لذاته. Right? So خف الضبط مع بقية الشروط, then this is known as حسن لذاته. حسن لذاته i.e. حسن, inherently حسن, as opposed to لا لشيء خارج. It's Hasan, inherently Hasan, and not Hasan because of an external factor. So what that basically means is that there are two types of Hasan. One is Hasan لذاته, inherently Hasan, and the other one is Hasan لغيره, is Hasan but because of a third factor, external factor is Hasan, and not because in and of itself. In and of itself is Hasan when the narrator falls in its dabt slightly below the level of the Sahih narrator. وهو الذي يكون حسنه بسبب الاعتضاد. Now from here, Imam Ibn Hajar is giving us the definition of Hasan لغيره. So he's given us the definition of Hasan لذاته. Hasan لذاته is إن خف الضبط مع بقية شروط الصحيح. That's حسن لذاته. Well, what is the definition of حسن لغيره? حسن لغيره is وهو الذي وهو أي الحسن لغيره هو الذي يكون حسنه بسبب الاعتضاد. The حسن لغيره is the حسن which is حسن because of corroboration. اعتضاد, because of corroboration, such as نحو حديث المستور. نحو حديث المستور, the hadith is the hadith of the mastur person. What is the mastur? Yeah, the mastur is the person who's there's both on him, okay, but we can't privilege one over the other because the jarh is mubham. Yeah, that's the mastur. Mastur is weak. A mastur narrator is weak in that sense because he's ambivalent. We don't know. So therefore, we definitely won't call him sahih. He'll be in the level of the weak narrator until we can vindicate him. Okay? نحو حديث المستور, such as the hadith of the mastur narrator, إذا تعددت طرقه, when there is more than one isnad. Okay? إذا تعددت طرقه. So what that basically Imam Ibn Hajar is saying, you've got one hadith, right? And in the hadith, the weakest link in the isnad is the mastur. Therefore, this hadith is weak. Okay? Then what happens is, you get more weak isnads. And each of them corroborate each other to the extent that now they become Hasan li ghayrihi. So Hasan li ghayrihi, in a sense, is many weak isnads get together, right? They bump up the hadith to Hasan li ghayrihi. Now, some people might basically say this hadith is, weak, and others will call it Hasan li ghayrihi. Just one question, Imam, brother Abdul Salam, is it? No, Shamsuddin. Okay, brother Shamsuddin mentioned that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal didn't have any, he had only weak hadiths or sahih hadiths in the Musnad Ahmad. So even within those weak hadiths are what we can now declare as Hasan hadith. Okay, anything in that time, anything which fell short of the sahih were all declared as weak. Yeah. So therefore, what was declared as weak by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, a lot of them is actually, according to our definition, is Hasan. Yeah.
So we derive from the weak hadith, the Hasan concept.
Yeah. Ji.
So what if the hadith are not mastur, but they're known to be da'if? So the jarh is mufassal.
No, that's fine. It's still, I mean, this is just, it's not a qaid ihtirazi. He's just giving you an example here. Yeah.
That will still be Hasan li ghayrihi.
Yeah. حسن لغيره. وخرج باشتراط باقي الأوصاف الضعيف, and by including the other qualities or the other conditions of the Sahih Hadith, the da'if is excluded. Okay? When we said that the Hasan li zatihi is the hadith which only there is a problem with one condition and all the other four conditions are remaining, by saying that we're excluding da'if hadiths from the Hasan. Because if there's a problem with the adala, or if there's a problem with the ittisal sanad, or if there's a problem, if there's a shaz, or if there's a munkar, munkar in the narration, then that doesn't render it Hasan, it renders the hadith weak. Said وَخَرَجَ, and excluded, وَخَرَجَ الضَّعِيفُ, the da'if is excluded by bringing in the other conditions. When he says وَالْمُرَادُ مَعَ بَقِيَةِ الشُّرُوطِ الْمُتَقَدِّمَةِ فِي حَدِّ الصَّحِيحِ, by bringing that bit in, we are excluding the da'if from the Hasan. So the Hasan is مَا خَفَّ ضَبْطُهُ مَعَ بَقِيَةِ الشُّرُوطِ الصَّحِيحِ. That's Hasan لذاته. Hasan لغيره is basically هو الذي يكون حسنه بسبب الاعتضاد. So those are the definitions. Hasan لذاته is الحسن هو فإن خف الضبط. Yeah, فإن خف, that's all you need to know. فإن خف الضبط من الصحيح, you can add that. فإن خف الضبط من الصحيح, that's Hasan. Hasan لغيره is that يكون حسنه بسبب الاعتداد. It's the weak hadith, but which has been fortified with a number of isnads that it's bumped up to the level of Hasan لغيره. Okay, that's why some ulama will call the Hasan لغيره hadith weak, and some will call it Hasan لغيره. There are more discussions on the Hasan which we'll do after the break, but one of the things that you will notice is that when we talk about, so we've mentioned Sahih Hasan li dhatihi, Hasan li ghayrihi, and we mentioned Sahih li zatihi, and we're going to mention Sahih li ghayrihi just after the break. So there's two Sahihs, right? Sahih li zatihi, inherently Sahih, and Sahih li ghayrihi. Sahih li ghayrihi is the Hasan hadith, which has so many different turuqs that we declare it to be a Sahih li ghayrihi. Yeah. The Hasan li ghayrihi is the da'if hadith with so many different isnads, we bump it to the level of hasan li ghayrihi. So the sahih li zatihi, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li zatihi, hasan li ghayrihi. Okay, but in a way, this is just an abstract academic discussion. It's an abstract academic discussion. When it comes to actual practices, ulama seldom use the categories of sahih li ghayrihi and hasan li ghayrihi. They seldom use that, unless somebody is writing a polemical treatise. You know what polemical is? Polemical basically means that you're attacking somebody else. Yeah? Somebody is writing a polemical treatise and they're responding to someone, and in that sense somebody will say, oh, this hadith. So let me give you an actual example. Right? The hadith is related to the iman of the Prophet ﷺ's parents. If you look at the discussions by the earlier muhaddithun, okay, they declare them to be weak. The hadiths which talks about the Prophet iman of the Prophet Prophet parents, if you look at the discussion of the earlier muhaddithun, they all declare them to be weak. Okay, they don't believe. Most of the earlier muhaddithun, it wasn't a mas'ala, it wasn't a discussion, okay, that engaged them. They weren't really interested in the Prophet ﷺ's parents. It's not a mas'ala that engaged them. It was only by the time of Imam Suyuti and because of Sufi influences and these mas'alas of the iman of the Prophet ﷺ, abwain, iman of the Prophet ﷺ, these mas'alas, they arose, and then the ulama had to respond to them. In the same way as the mas'ala of the iman of Abu Talib wasn't something that engaged the earlier scholars. They had their own problems of, for example, whether taqdeer, Inna al-amra unfun, whether taqdeer was real or not. Okay, al-manzila bayn al-manzilatayn, right? Whether kabira is take somebody out of iman or not. Those were the problems that they were dealing with. Whether mas'al al-khuffayn, right? Was it a part? Is it a part of Islam or not? And that's why Imam Tahawi includes the issue of mas'al al-khuffayn. Mas'al al-khuffayn is a fiqhi issue, right? To wipe over leather socks is a fiqhi issue. What on earth would that be doing in an aqidah book, such as Aqidah al-Tahawiyah? Why would Mas'al al-Khuffayn be in an aqidah book? Because Mas'al al-Khuffayn became a sign of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah as opposed to the Shias. So now, like nowadays, when somebody sees, I don't know in the Pakistani community, but especially in the Bangladeshi community, when somebody sees somebody else wearing leather socks, immediately they'll think that person is a Tablighi Jamaat, because mainly it's the Tablighi Jamaat from the Bangladeshis who wear, the leather socks. The Sufis and the Fultulis, they won't wear leather socks. So immediately that becomes a shi'ar of the Tablighi Jamaat. So at that time, the Mutaqaddimun, they had those problems and they were dealing with those problems, right? The iman of Abu Talib or iman of the Prophet's parents was not something that engaged them because it wasn't an issue during that time. Later on, it became an issue. So they were able to make these comments. Like Imam Nasai in the Sunan Nasai, he has a whole chapter in the Kitab al-Janaiz, Babu ma ja'a fi ziyarati qubur al-mushrikeen, the chapter on what is narrated from the Prophet ﷺ about visiting the grave of the mushrikun. Right? This is in the Sunan al-Nasai. Under that chapter, he brings the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ went and visited his parents, and from there he declared that it's permissible to go and visit the grave of the mushrikun. Okay, because of the Prophet ﷺ. That was there, and it's not something that engaged them. It wasn't an issue of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. It's later on when these things were thrown into relief. People like Imam Suyuti and others, they were able to write on this topic, and then Imam Suyuti then falls back onto these kind of subsidiary issues. Okay, he says, okay, individually, all of the hadiths might be weak. right? But if we look at the isnad strands, then we can call them hasan li ghayrihi. They're hasan. Do you understand? But in what I'm basically trying to say is that in practical application, these four designations of sahih li zatihi, sahih li ghayrihi, hasan li zatihi, hasan li ghayrihi is just an academic, abstract academic discussion. Hardly the li ghayrihi, the sahih li ghayrihi and the sahih and the hasan li ghayrihi is not used. Okay? The sahih li ghayrihi, the ulama will just basically say it's a hasan hadith, it's hasan. The hasan li ghayrihi, the ulama will say it's weak. It's only when there is a confrontation and when somebody wants to prove a point and to bolster the status of the hadith, then they might resort to such arguments saying, yes, but if you look at all of the turks of the hadith, we can actually qualify it to be a hasan hadith. Does that make sense? Okay, let's take a break, inshallah. I stop this?
Leave it on.
Inshallah. Let's take a 10 minutes. After studying this, if your Arabic is good, you have understood the masail properly, you won't need to study Tadrib al-Rawi with the teacher. Yeah, you can study on your own, and that's the kind. I mean, in Azhar in masters they teach Tadrib al-Rawi, right? But you shouldn't need to, because you understood the mas'ala. Now it's just the ikhtilaf around it. Yeah. But it's the practical bit which is important. Yeah.
The Manhajul
Manhajul Naqd.
that book you said you enjoyed that book.
Yeah.
What's different about that book?
If you go to my PhD thesis, you have it, right, and it's in the appendix. In the appendix to my book, one of the appendix. Got it here. Let's see. Page 255. Yeah, in one of the appendix, I basically do an entire khulasa of the whole book. One of the reasons why the reason why I like the book is because um, the way that Ibn Salah, Imam Ibn Salah is the one who's written the 65 categories. The way that he arranged the material in the book, it's quite difficult to see the relationship between the different topics. Yeah, but even in Ibn Hajar's book, it's sometimes difficult to see the relations as well. And the way that Nuruddin Itr breaks it down, he lumps them according to the relationships. So that's why it's quite good.
Is it at the same level as
Say that again.
Is it the same level as Nuzha?
In a way, it's easier than Nuzha. In a way, it's easier. Where's the bathroom? I'm just gonna go to the bathroom. I'm sure everything is available. Shall we start? Yes.
What did he measure the narrator's academic ability again?
The others. Yeah. All his classmates. So they'll compare already, I mean, last time we basically looked at that the classmates can be classified. If you have one Sheikh, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, he might have 5 levels of students. The first level of students are the ones who stayed with him, for the entire life, and they were quite stalwart scholars. Okay, and then the second level, third level, fourth level, fifth level, and then basically compare with the other classmates to see how much they deviate from the classmates. That's how they do it. Because remember that here, what we're dealing with, we're not dealing with understanding of the hadith. We're not dealing with what the hadith means, or what are the implications, or what are the fiqh of the hadith. In this subject, the only thing that we are dealing with is we are ascertaining whether something came from the Prophet ﷺ or not, irrelevant of what it means. Okay, this is a historical piece of work that we're doing. All we're trying to establish is whether this report came from the Prophet ﷺ or not. And one of the ways of establishing that is basically looking at the wordings and how it's been transmitted. So all we're doing is taking a narrator, seeing how many other people have narrated the same hadith at the same time, or different times, but from the same teacher, okay, and seeing how they transmitted it, the words, and how this person transmitted it. And if this person's transmission is different from the rest, then either we accept his difference or we reject it, depending on the different conditions. Okay, but we also need to classify him. If he's making a difference, if it's deviating continuously, perpetually, most of the time, then we might think that this person is not really a strong. He's not attentive in class. Therefore, he's not a very strong student. That's how you do it. Yes.
Check with this, like you comparing one narrator to like his classmate. So are there fundamental sort of narrators that you just don't even look at, like it's just a given? Like,
Sahabis.
Like, let's say Imam Malik, for example.
No.
He's,
Imam Malik had to go through. Imam Malik had to, before Imam Malik, before he was Imam Darul, Imam Darul Hijrah, he was Malik ibn Anas. He had to go through exactly the same scrutiny. Bukhari had to go through the same scrutiny. All of them had to go through the baptism of fire and water. They had to all go through it.
so what you're really doing is you're actually looking at, because
It's big, isn't it?
it's sort of like, when they say like you compare this narrator to his fellow, well obviously that narrator needs to be compared to, and so you really is just collecting all these.
It's data. It's collecting of data. It's basically you making a statistical database, right? But that statistical database is only one part of it. There is a qualitative element to it as well. Okay. Have you heard of the Mawlawi Hargiz Nashud Mawla Room Tanagiri Shamshid Tabriz Nashud? Maulana Rumi says that Rumi could have never been the Mawla Room had it not been for the company of Shamsuddin Tabrizi. So all of them had to go through this baptism of fire and water. They had to all of them go through it. Yahya ibn Ma'in talks about his dad, Ma'in. He says, ضعيف في الحديث. أبي ولكن ضعيف في الحديث. He might be my dad, but he's weak. Yeah. Imam, what's he called? Which narrator was it? Abdullah ibn Mubarak. I was reading in his biography that he went to this masjid and he asked people, the students of such and such sheikh if they're around, can you please come and narrate the hadiths from me, his hadiths to me? And many of the students, they came to him and they narrated the hadith to him. And he said, these are people. Yeah, so they use the word 70, right? 70 is, in Arabic is for takthir, right? Because these people, I do not doubt their sincerity and their iman, but I can swear by Allah that it will be haram for me to narrate hadith from them. Yeah? Why do you think that is? No. He specifically asked that the students of that particular sheikh who's passed away, he went to this new place. Okay, apparently there was a sheikh there. I don't remember the details. So students of, I want to study hadiths of that sheikh. The students of that sheikh, can you please, come and narrate the hadiths to me? So they did, and then afterwards he writes. He says that I swear by Allah, these 70 or more people, I do not doubt their sincerity and their iman, but it will be haram to take anything that they've said. And the reason why is because he's basically declaring them weak, because he must have had the hadiths of that sheikh from different turuqs. And what he's doing is what these people are saying, he's comparing them with the turuqs that he's already had, and he's basically making a judgment. Says, it'll be haram for me. I don't doubt their sincerity and their iman, right? Just because you're pious doesn't necessarily mean you're a scholar. Yeah, I don't doubt their sincerity and their iman, but it'll be haram for me to take anything from them. Chalo, Bismillah. وهذا القسم من الحسن مشارك للصحيح في الاحتجاج به وإن كان دونه ومشابه له في انقسامه إلى مراتب بعضها فوق بعض. And this type, هذا القسم من الحسن, this type of حسن, حسن لذاته, مشارك للصحيح, it shares with the sahih as far as acting upon it and using it as not acting upon it, but using it as ihtijaj, as hujjah. Meaning that a sahih hadith, you're able to use it as a hujjah, as an evidence. Okay, the hasan hadith also, you are allowed to use it as an evidence, as opposed to some da'if hadiths that you are not allowed to use as evidence. Okay, as opposed to some da'if hadiths that you are allowed to use as evidence, but only as corroboration, not as primary evidence. So you have something which is a primary evidence. Let's say, I don't know, you're trying to talk about a mas'ala, non-Muslims able to inherit from Muslims. Okay, your primary evidence for that might be the Quran ayat. Okay, now after the Quran ayat, you don't need any secondary evidence. Okay, but sometimes the Quran ayat the meaning might be quite ambiguous, so then you need the hadith to give us the correct reading of the Quran ayat. Yeah, so then you're using the hadiths as a secondary evidence to fortify the primary evidence. Okay, or sometimes let's take a masla, for example, you're in ihram and you haven't taken your ihram off, and it's the third day of Hajj. What do you do? Do you do dam or you don't do dam? You won't find that in the Quran. You find a hadith. Okay, maybe a hadith, a sahih hadith. The Hanafis basically say you have to do dam. Hanbali say you don't have to do dam. What happens then is that maybe you need to find another hadith which consolidates your position, right? But those other hadiths are weak, okay? But they still give a proper reading to the asl. The asl might be a bit vague, okay? So then you use these as secondary evidences, okay? This is what it means by asl, primary and secondary evidences. Some hadiths you are able to use them as primary evidences, some hadiths you're only allowed to use them as secondary evidences, and some hadiths you're not even allowed to use them as secondary hadiths. You're not allowed to use them as any kind of evidence unless it's basically for fadila. So Hasan hadith, you're allowed to use it as al-ihtijaj bihi, as primary evidence. وَإِن كَانَ دُونَهُ, even though the Hasan hadith is lower in degree and in status than the Sahih hadith. So it's musharikun للصحيح في الاحتجاج به ومشابه له في انقسامه إلى مراتب بعضها فوق بعض. And also it's similar to the Sahih hadith as far as categorizing it according to different levels. Yeah, you know, before we looked at the different levels of Sahih. You know, those which are in the Sahihain, and then those which are muhtaf bil qara'in, and all the 7 different levels. Those which are in which are not in the Sahih Bukhari or Muslim, but those which are found according to their shart, which I still need to give you hadith for, right? And those which are on the shart of Bukhari, those which are on the shart of Muslim. So we've given these 7 classifications of the Sahih hadith. So here you will have also classifications of the Hasan hadith depending on the isnad. So you might have such as an Amr ibn Shu'ayb and Abihi and Jaddihi, which is a Hasan isnad. That isnad is Hasan isnad. Might be A'la Maratib al-Hasan. Then you'll have the isnad of Bahz ibn Hakim as a secondary classification. So you'll have different maratibs. You'll probably have the hadiths which come in the Sunan al-Tirmizi or Sunan Abu Dawood are much more stringent than the hadiths which come in Sunan al-Darimi. So you will have those classifications. But like I mentioned to you before, these classifications are just a fancy way of kind of conceptualizing these issues. When it comes to actual classifying hadith for individual purposes, then that kind of maratib goes out of the window. Nobody. This is just a very nice way of academic abstract classification. وبكثرة طرقه يصحح. And if the Hasan hadith has many different strands, it's not necessary that it needs to have many different strands. It can have one strand of isnad, or you can have 2 strands of isnad, the hadith. But if he has many different strands, yusahhah, that Hasan hadith becomes sahih. Yeah, but it's not sahih li dhatihi, it's sahih li ghayrihi. Okay, now you can understand that somebody might basically say that this hadith is Hasan, and somebody else might come and say this hadith is Sahih li ghayrihi. Mainly Sahih li ghayrihi will be used in polemical context. Okay, because if there is no contest, there is no difference between the Sahih and the Hasan as far as doing hujjah, as far as amal and using it as an evidence. Nobody will bat an eyelid. But let's say you've got 2 hadiths which are contradicting, right? One is Sahih and the other one is let's say Hasan. Okay, and somebody is basically saying, the Shaykh Albani is saying, well, this hadith is Hasan and this hadith is Sahih. We will leave the Hasan for the Sahih hadith. Yeah. And let's say somebody who's Sheikh Muhammad Awama or Sheikh Abdul Fattah Bughudda is responding to Albani and is saying, well, no, we can't get rid of it. We have to do ta'wil between them, right? We have to reconcile between them, because this hadith is also sahih, is sahih li ghayrihi. Okay, so in a polemical context where they want to throw into relief the differences and similarities, that's when they might use the card of sahih li ghayrihi, sahih hasan li ghayrihi. وبكثرة طرقه يصحح, and because of the numerous isnads, the hadith is sahih. وإنما نحكم له بالصحة صحة عند تعدد الطرق, and we declare it to be sahih when there is a different isnad strands. لأن للصورة المجموعة قوة, because this collective scenario has strength. قوة تجبر القدر الذي قصر به ضبط راوي الحسن عن راوي الصحيح. This collective scenario has strength. How? تجبر القدر الذي قصر. It compensates that level of flow, FLAW, قصر به ضبط راوي الحسن. It compensates the level of flow in the academic ability of the narrator of the Hasan Hadith has from the Sahih. So basically he's saying that when we have many different isnad strands, all of these isnad strands in a way compensate the minute flow that the Rawi of the Hasan Hadith has over the Rawi of the the Hasan Hadith. It falls below the Rawi of the Sahih. It compensates for that. إجبار النقصان. ومن ثم تطلق الصحة على الإسناد الذي يكون حسنا لذاته لو تفرد إذا تعدد. And from that perspective, the word sahih is applied to the isnad على الإسناد الذي يكون حسنا لذاته, is applied to the hasan لذاته isnad had it been on its own. لو تفرد, had it been on its own. إذا تعدد, when the isnads are many in number. Okay, the Arabic is a bit obscure here, so let's look at it again. وَمِن ثَمَّ, from this perspective of what we have said, تطلق الصحة, the word صحة or authenticity is applied على الإسناد, on the isnad الذي يكون حسنا لذاته لو تفرد, on the isnad which would have been hasan lidhati if it was just on its own. لو تفرد. When is the siha applied? إذا تعدد, when the isnad is more than one. So can you see the Arabic? It's this is Mamluk Arabic. Okay, the Mamluk Arabic is a bit more. This is simple Mamluk Arabic, but it's a bit more. The construction, sentence construction, is a bit more difficult than what we would expect in modern standard Arabic. تطلق الصحة على الإسناد الذي يكون حسنا لذاته لو تفرد إذا تعدد. Yeah. وهذا حيث ينفرد الوصف. All of this that we have mentioned is from the perspective of when the designation of Hasan or the attribution is Hasan is on its own. So when we say هذا حديث حسن, this hadith is Hasan, then this is what it refers. What we have discussed only refers to when we are just talking about Hasan hadith on its own. So when we talk about Hasan hadith on its own, we have got three classifications of Hasan hadith. Okay, number one, Hasan lidhatihi. Hasan lidhatihi is when the Rawi of the Hasan falls below the level of the Rawi of the Sahih. Only in that condition, and the remaining four conditions of the Sahih are still intact. Yeah, number one. Number two is that in a weak hadith, for example, the hadith where in the isnad a masturul hal person comes, if there are many isnads to fortify that isnad of the masturul hal. So the isnad of the masturul hal is the isnad that we're just focusing on. It can be any isnads. We're just focusing on that particular isnad. When the isnad of the masturul hal is fortified by other asanid, then that weak hadith gets bumped up to the level of Hasan, but we call it Hasan لغيره. حسنه بطريق الاعتضاد. Yeah, that's called Hasan لغيره. Okay, then the third one is صحيح لغيره. صحيح لغيره is وبكثرة تعدد طرق الحسن لذاته يصحح. When the Hasan لذاته itself, yeah, when the Hasan لذاته itself has many different turuqs, then it becomes Sahih لغيره. Did you understand the three levels? And do you remember a few weeks ago or months ago we discussed that a khabr wahid, this is all khabr wahid, a khabr wahid can also, khabr wahids normally are what we call ghalabatul dhann, they give a probabilistic knowledge, okay, but khabr wahid can also give us ilm yaqini. And one of the ways that a khabr wahid can give us ilm yaqini is if the khabr wahid is a Hasan hadith and every single turuq of the Hasan hadith, there is no weak narrator in the turuqs of the Hasan hadith. Because a hadith can be Hasan because of the strongest isnad. It might have more turuqs, but these turuqs, these isnads might be weak. It's just the hadith is Hasan because of the strongest isnad. But here, الخبر الواحد محتف بالقرائن يفيد العلم اليقيني إذا كان طرق حسن الحديث الحسن كله صحيحا أو كله حسنا لا يوجد فيه أي راو فيه ضعف. So if every single narrator of the Hasan of the isnads of the Hasan hadith has only Hasan narrators and doesn't fall below that, then that is also al-khabr al-wahid al-muhtaf bil-qara'in yufid al-ilm al-yaqini. Is that okay? All of this discussion was when we say hadha hadithun hasan, as opposed to you can have compound terminologies. Yeah, compound term, murakkab, al-mustalah, al-murakkab. You can have hasan compounded with another terminology. For example, hasanun sahihun, or hasanun gharibun, or hasanun sahihun gharibun. Yeah, when you have the word hasan compounded with another terminology, then that has a completely different set of rules. What we have been discussing here is Hasan on its own. Is that okay? Fortunately, Hasan, when it's compounded with other terminologies, you will not come across it very much. In fact, the only book that you will come across it is the Sunan al-Tirmidhi. It is a unique feature of Sunan al-Tirmidhi that he has these compound terminologies. Yep. فإن جمع أي الصحيح والحسن, if the Sahih and Hasan come together في وصف واحد, yeah, in one attribute, you can call it, or in one designation, كقول الترمذي وغيره حديث حسن صحيح, such as Imam Tirmidhi's saying حديث حسن صحيح. Imam Tirmidhi's and others very rarely say it. Okay, we find that Imam Tirmidhi says that Imam Bukhari said this hadith is Hasanun Sahih, or Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal has said that this hadith is Hasanun Sahih. But when you actually check up Bukhari and Musnad for that exact hadith, then you don't find them saying that. So it might just be Imam Tirmizi putting this in their mouth. Okay. كقول الترمذي وغيره هذا حديث حسن صحيح. Now what's going to happen is he's going to give the hukum of these compound terminologies. What does it mean? Now the compound terminologies of Imam Tirmizi, out of the entire hadith science, the compound terminology of Imam Tirmizi is one of the most difficult to understand. And in my opinion, and I think I can have an opinion on that because I did a PhD on Tirmizi. In my opinion, I don't think anybody has cracked this enigma. And that's why on my chapter on Hassan in the PhD thesis, I conclude the discussion by quoting Imam Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi in his book Al-Muqidha. And I'll tell you what I write. But just as an academic, because we're studying this, we might as well just listen to it. Imam al-Dhahabi in his book Al-Muqidha, he says, do not wish for a strict set of rules for Hasan, under the rubric of which all Hasan hadith falls. He says, I have despaired of finding any such rules. This is Dhahabi. I know Dhahabi is the one Imam Ibn Hajar went to Hajj and he said, Allah give me more knowledge of hadith than Dhahabi. Imam Dhahabi says, I have despaired of finding any such rules. There are many hadiths regarding which the scholars are uncertain. Are they sahih, hasan or da'if? In fact, one and the same scholar will change his view regarding a single hadith. Hence, he will call it sahih one day, whilst on another day he will define it as hasan. And sometimes he will call it da'if. This is the reality of the situation. And I conclude the entire discussion on Hasan with this statement from Imam al-Dhahabi from his book Al-Muqidha, that is very difficult. And that's why I say when I started my PhD, I had slight understanding what Hasan is. When I finished, I have confused myself. I don't know what Hasan is. Added to this complex, what Imam Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi mentions, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, call him Imam Dhahabi from now on. Imam Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi mentions, added to that is the problem with the manuscripts of Sunan al-Tirmidhi. If you look at the manuscripts of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, you'll have the lithographic Indian print, you have the Shu'aib Arnaut print, you have the Bashar Awad Ma'aruf print, you have the Ahmad Shakir print, you have the Muassasatul Risala print. These are all printed editions from different manuscripts of the Sunan al-Tirmidhi. If you were to compare those, and in my PhD thesis I had to basically look through all of those. If you have to compare those, you will see in some manuscripts a hadith is Imam Tirmidhi says Haza hadithun hasanun, right? You look in, so say if you look at Arnaut's version, it says Haza hadithun hasanun because he's using a particular manuscript. If you look at the same hadith in Bashar Awad Ma'aruf's print, it says Haza hadithun hasanun sahih. If you look at Ahmad Shakir's version, it'll say Haza hadithun hasanun sahihun gharibun. If you look at the lithographic Indian print, it says Haza hadithun gharibun. Now, which one is correct? It's the same hadith, but the different prints are giving you different hukum for the same hadith, right? Added to that is another layer of complexion, and that is that Imam al-Tirmidhi has got two books other than the Sunan al-Tirmidhi called Kitab al-Ilal. One is called Kitab al-Ilal al-Saghir, which is appended to the end of the Sunan al-Tirmidhi. So that's like Imam Tirmidhi's Usul al-Hadith book. It's at the end of the Sunan al-Tirmidhi. But then he has another book called Ilal al-Kabir, Kitab al-Ilal al-Kabir, right? So in the Ilal al-Kabir, he goes through the ahadith that is mentioned in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, but this time he's doing more isnad analysis. He's going through the illah. Whereas the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, I don't know if any of you have looked into the Sunan al-Tirmidhi. In the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Imam al-Tirmidhi is giving you the hukum of the hadith, is giving you the fiqh of the hadith, which madhab, this particular hadith has been used. And whenever Imam Tirmidhi uses Shafi'i, then he uses Shafi'i's old madhab. You know that Imam Shafi'i has got two madhabs. Yeah? So at-Tirmidhi's Sunan al-Tirmidhi is basically the major source for recognizing the Shafi'i's old madhab, because he quotes from Za'afrani. But those are all the different things, and it's giving you an explanation of the hadith. But the Ilal al-Tirmidhi al-Kabir is just like a Jarh Ta'adil hadith book par excellence. In there he's going into isnad analysis. If you compare the hadith that is found in Ilal al-Kabir, one hadith, and that same hadith is found in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, and you compare the hukum, you'll find that Imam Tirmidhi is giving different hukums. One hadith he just calls hadithun, haza hadithun hasan, and in the other one he says haza hadithun hasanun sahihun gharibun. So that confuses things, like what on earth, right, is happening here. So in my PhD, I developed a theory of how to get rid of all of that. Okay, I will tell you my theory at the end, just by and by, just so that you know what my theory is. But what I'm trying to say to you is, let's just read what Ibn Hajar says without going too much into it, because if you're trying to rack our brains, right, then people before us have tried doing that and they couldn't come to a conclusion. Chances are that we won't come to a conclusion. Okay. Is that okay? I know that it's a bit daunting, but read it as an academic exercise. Now, when Imam al-Tirmidhi says هذا حديث حسن صحيح, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with having هذا حديث حسن صحيح? There is a problem. A hadith cannot be Hasan and Sahih at the same time, because Hasan by definition is ما خف ضبطه من الصحيح. It's lower than a Sahih hadith. The Rawi is lower than a hadith Sahih. So how can the hadith be Hasan and Sahih at the same time? Either the hadith is Hasan or the hadith is Sahih, because hadith Hasan and Sahih are contradictory. Hasan by definition is something which falls below the level of Sahih. So do you get the issue? So how can a hadith be hadithun hasanun sahih? So if I was to give you an example, are you with me or have I lost you? Right. The very first hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi. Yeah. عن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه قال لا تقبل صلاة بغير طهور ولا صدقة من غلول. Prophet ﷺ said that salat is not accepted without tahara. Imam al-Tirmidhi says هذا الحديث أصح شيء في هذا الباب وأحسن. So that's another way of saying it. It's the most asah and the most ahsan. Let's give you another hadith. Right. إذا the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا تودأ العبد المسلم أو المؤمن فغسل وجهه خرجت من وجهه كل خطيئة نظر إليها بعينيه مع الماء. That whenever a Muslim does wudu, washes his face, then all the sins go out from his face as the water falls down. إذا غسل يديه خرجت من يديه كل خطيئة. When he washes his arms and his hands, all the sins go. مع آخر قطر الماء حتى يخرج نقيا من الذنوب. By the end of the wudu, the believer comes out fresh, free from all sins. Imam al-Tirmidhi says هذا حديث حسن صحيح. This hadith is Hasan Sahih. Right? This is an example. Now there's a problem here, that this hadith is a Muslim hadith. Okay? And sometimes you'll get Bukhari hadith. So, is it Hasan or is it Sahih? So that's the problem here, that the Hasan hadith is lower in status than the Sahih hadith. How can the hadith be Hasan and Sahih at the same time? Imam Ibn Hajar says, فإن جمع أي الصحيح والحسن في وصف واحد كقول الترمذي وغيره حديث حسن صحيح فالتردد الحاصل من المجتهد في الناقل. Imam al-Tirmidhi says that the doubt or the trepidation has happened from the mujtahid as far as transmission of the hadith is concerned. هل اجتمعت فيه شروط الصحة أو قصر عنها وهذا حيث يحصل منه التفرد بتلك الرواية. That does this hadith, or do all the narrators of the hadith, do they have all the conditions of the Sahih in them, or do they fall below the Sahih? And that's as far as if you have a hadith with only one isnad. Yeah, you can get a hadith with one isnad. So basically, Imam Ibn Hajar is saying that when it says هذا حديث حسن صحيح, and there is only one isnad to that hadith, then that's because the mujtahid, or the person who's looking into the isnad, or the transmitter, he has a shak, a doubt, taraddud, a trepidation, whether all of the narrators fulfill the condition of sahih or they fall below that. And because of that it says هذا حديث حسن صحيح, to express that trepidation, to express this doubt that they have, that yeah, it's borderline. Yeah. وعرف بهذا, and from this it is understood جواب من استشكل الجمع بين الوصفين, the answer to the objection of these two qualities coming together. فقال الحسن قاصر عن الصحيح, and the objection is that Hasan falls below the level of Sahih. ففي الجمع بين الوصفين, and by putting both of these two adjectives together, إثبات لذلك القصور ونفيه, is accepting and rejecting that shortcoming. So remember the objection that I said, that Hasan falls below the level of Sahih. So if you say Hasanun Sahihun, you are, by saying Hasan, you are accepting this shortcoming, okay, خف الضبط, and then by saying Sahihun, you are rejecting that shortcoming. But how can that be إثبات ونفي الوصف أو ونفي خف الضبط في صفة واحد? How is that possible? That's the إشكال. And Imam Ibn Hajar is saying that the way I'm answering it is that I'm saying that the reason why the narrator said that is not because he's saying that this hadith is sahih and hasan at the same time, but the narrator is expressing his his reluctance, or expressing his doubt that maybe this is sahih hadith, but maybe it might be hasan. He's not saying it's hasan, he's saying that there is maybe a chance. Okay? Hesitation. That's the word I'm looking for. Taraddud, hesitation. So then Imam Ibn Hajar then gives, do you understand the jawab? Does that make sense? Okay, so when we find in Tirmizi, Haza hadithun hasanun sahih, what that basically means is that the hadith is sahih, but the narrator here, Imam Tirmizi, there is a hesitation on his part that this might just be a hasan hadith, and because there is a hesitation in his part, he's basically giving both hukum, hasan, sahih. He's giving the khulasa, the summary of that again. وَمُحَسَّلُ الْجَوَابِ, and the summary of this answer is أن تردد أئمة الحديث في حال ناقضه اقتضى للمجتهد ألا يصفه بأحد الوصفين. That the hesitation of the hadith, as far as the transmitter is concerned, demands from the mujtahid. The mujtahid is the one who's doing the isnad analysis. Here is Imam Tirmizi. ألا يصفه بأحد الوصفين, demands from the mujtahid that he does not designate the hadith with only one adjective. He doesn't say هذا حديث صحيح, or he doesn't say هذا حديث حسن, because there is taraddud, there is hesitation. فيقال فيه حسن باعتبار وصفه عند قوم صحيح باعتبار وصفه عند قوم. So therefore the hadith is hasan according to meeting the standards of hasan according to some people, and it's sahih because it meets the standards of sahih according to some people. وغاية ما فيه, and the most that we can say is أنه حذف منه حرف التردد, the conjunction, the harf of hesitation has been removed. لأن حقه أن يقول, because it's more appropriate to say hasanun aw sahih. So what Imam Ibn Hajar is saying is, what's happening here is, when Imam Tirmizi says haza hadithun hasanun sahih, actually what he's saying is haza hadithun hasanun aw sahihun. This hadith is either hasan or sahih. There's a hesitation. So he just knocked out the aw, the harf al-taraddud. So when you say هذا حديث حسن صحيح, it means هذا حديث حسن أو صحيح. And this knocking out, they do that always in hadith, right? حدثنا مالك, then you'll find حدثنا مالك, حدثنا نافع, حدثنا ابن عمر, right? What's knocked out here is حدثنا مالك قال حدثنا نافع قال حدثنا ابن عمر. The qala is knocked out. They do that always in hadith. They knock these things out, right? They omit them and they assume that the reader knows. Okay? Sometimes they won't even put حدثنا. They'll just put thana, a short, and they'll put na. Thana means حدثنا, na means أخبرنا. So these are all shorthands. Okay? Sometimes you will have an isnad, right, which goes like this. You'll have, let's say, you'll have an isnad which goes like this. Malik Malik an Abdullah ibn Dinar an Ibn Umar. Yeah? You'll have a second isnad which goes like القاعنة B. You'll have a second isnad which looks like this. So you have the first isnad Malik an Abdullah ibn Dinar an Abdullah ibn Umar. And the second isnad will look like this. Abdullah ibn Maslama حدثنا Abdullah ibn Maslama al-Qa'nabi, and then we just have ha. Yeah, which basically means tahweel of the isnad, which means ha means follow the isnad. This isnad Abdullah ibn, so it'll be al-Qa'nabi an Abdullah ibn Dinar an Ibn Umar. What we basically do in English as, we put this sign of 11, that's what it means, ha. Abdullah ibn Maslama al-Qa'nabi ha. Yep. So they have all of these shorthands. What Imam Ibn Hajar is basically saying here is that when Imam al-Tirmidhi says هذا حديث حسن صحيح, it basically means هذا حديث حسن أو صحيح. He's taken out the حرف التردد which is أو, لأن حقه أن يقول حسن أو صحيح، وهذا كما حذف حرف العطف من الذي بعده. وعلى هذا فما قيل فيه حسن صحيح. So in that context, when the hadith is حسن صحيح دون ما قيل فيه صحيح, that hadith is lower than a صحيح، لأن الجزم أقوى من التردد, because certainty is stronger than hesitancy, than a doubt. So he's giving a classification here. You have a hadith where somebody says هذا حديث صحيح، هذا حديث حسن صحيح، هذا حديث حسن. Okay, now هذا حديث صحيح is at the top. هذا حديث حسن صحيح is in the middle. هذا حديث حسن is third. Because حديث حسن صحيح, because it's there is a doubt, hesitancy whether it's a sahih or it's a hasan. Because there's a hesitancy, it falls lower than a sahih but higher than a hasan hadith. Does that make sense? So when you read at-Tirmidhi هذا حديث حسن صحيح, is that going to be okay? You'll be able to understand what Imam Ibn Hajar is saying. Yeah? Any questions?
Is there not a possibility that Imam Tirmidhi meant by Hasan Sahih, Hasan li Ghayri? Sahih li Ghayri. Because Sahih li Ghayri is multiple Hasan hadiths to Sahih.
Sahih li ghayrihi. The problem with that is that's a good question. Good observation. The Brother Zain is saying that can it not be that Imam Tirmidhi by this means that this hadith is Hasan li ghayrihi. Sahih li ghayrihi. Remember, the Sahih li ghayrihi is the Hasan hadith. Yeah, the Hasan hadith which has many isnads to the extent that gets bumped up to the level of Sahih. So in that sense, it's Hasan and it's Sahih li ghayrihi. That's a good observation. But the problem with that is that Imam Tirmidhi sometimes says هذا حديث حسن صحيح غريب. This is Hasan Sahih Gharib. And Gharib is that there's no different turuq. Okay? Let me find an example. Ji.
So is it all based on like a certain narrator that they've got a doubt on?
Is it based on a certain? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I can't find it now. So that's Hasan Sahih. But Imam Ibn Hajar says, وَهَذَا حَيْثُ التَّفَرُّدْ. Right? See, Zain Sab, he's saying, وَهَذَا حَيْثُ التَّفَرُّدْ. This is when the hadith has only one isnad. Yeah? So, when the hadith has one isnad, وَهَذَا حَيْثُ التَّفَرُّدْ, he's basically saying that Hasan Sahih means Hasanun aw Sahihun. However, if the Hasan hadith has got more than one isnad, وإلا إذا لم يحصل التفرد, however, if there isn't a tafarrud, فإطلاق الوصفين معا على الحديث يكون باعتبار إسنادين. That designating those two adjectives on this hadith is according to the two different isnads. أحدهما صحيح والآخر حسن. The first one is sahih and the second one is hasan. Imam Ibn Hajar is saying, when you have a hadith and it only has one isnad, and Imam Tirmizi says هذا حديث حسن صحيح, then we have to declare that this means هذا حديث حسن أو صحيح. There is a hesitancy, taraddud, in one of the narrators, right? And therefore that hadith falls below the sahih but above the hasan. It's in the middle. However, if the hadith has got more than one isnad, then what we basically, the way he's reading it is, we're going to say هذا حديث حسن صحيح means that one isnad of that hadith is sahih and the other isnad of that hadith is hasan. And what Imam Tirmidhi is trying to show, I mean, that hadith is sahih, right? Because remember the hadith is declared sahih, da'if or hasan according to the strongest isnad. So if the strongest isnad is sahih, then the hadith is sahih. We don't need to basically then say this hadith is hasan. Yeah? But what Ibn Hajar is saying is that what Imam Tirmidhi is doing is telling us that there are some isnads which are hasan and there are some isnads which are sahih. So he's just dividing the isnads. So isnadain ahaduhuma sahihun wal akharu hasanun wa ala hadha. And according to this reading of the one isnad is sahih and one isnad is da'if, qila fihi, it is said hasanun sahihun fawqa ma qila fihi sahihun. The one hadith where we say هذا حديث حسن صحيح is stronger than the hadith which is just صحيح فقط إذا كان فردا لأن كثرة الطرق تقوي, because the more the isnads, the more the stronger. So if we basically say that this one hadith has got many isnads, and some isnads are hasan and some isnads are sahih, then from that angle the hadith which is هذا حديث حسن صحيح is stronger than a hadith where we only say هذا حديث صحيح and there's only one isnad for that hadith. Right, let me explain that. this is the first scenario, only one isnad. Let's say this narrator here, student, yeah, some people have called him Sahih, some people have called him Hasan. Yeah? Because of him, Imam Tirmizi says, هذا حديث حسن صحيح. There is taraddud in this student, but this student is the one who is bringing the level down. Okay? So this isnad is basically, we got Sahih, Sahih, and then we got Hasan. This isnad is here. This isnad, yeah, Hasan Sahih. Because of the doubt, it's weaker than the Sahih, but stronger than the Hasan. Can you see the board from the back? Yeah. Then you've got the second isnad. Yeah. We'll just use this isnad. Yeah. Get rid of this. We've got the second isnad where yeah. Right. So he's the tabi'i is what we call the madarul isnad. Is the common link. What Ibn Hajar is saying is that, let's say one isnad strand, right? Everybody, let's say this one. Everybody is strong. Yeah? The entire isnad is sahih. Let's say this isnad strand, right? Is also strong. Everybody is sahih in this isnad strand. Okay? But this one here, let's say this student, right, is Hasan. This student might be sahih, this tabi'i is sahih, but this student here might be Hasan. So then this isnad, because of this student, remember an isnad is declared weak, or isnad is designated a classification according to the weakest narrator. The weakest narrator here is this student who is Hasan. This isnad strand then becomes Hasan. Now we got this hadith where we have sahih isnads, we also have a Hasan isnad, right? In that case, this hadith is هذا حديث حسن صحيح, but the classification will be like this. Yeah, this hadith is stronger than a sahih hadith, right? Because there's Hasan isnads and there's also sahih isnads, as opposed to the first scenario where there was only one sahih isnad. Or even if there wasn't a taraddud, it was a sahih. But here we've got sahih, and then Hasan. Okay, three sahihs and Hasan. It consolidates, it fortifies the hadith more, and therefore the Hasan sahih is actually above the sahih. Does that make sense? G. Sorry?
Sahih Garib, it's just one.
Yeah.
But the other mashhur and stuff, they're higher than the Hasan Sahih.
Let's say that again, sorry.
Like you got Hasan Sahih.
Yeah.
Right, and you got Sahih below it.
Yeah.
That's only Sahih Garib.
Yeah, Sahih Gharib, yeah.
Not mashhur and the other.
No, Sahih Gharib, when there was only one isnad strand. Yeah. Yeah. This is only about the one. Yeah. وعلى هذا فما قيل فيه حسن صحيح فوق ما قيل فيه صحيح فقط إذا كان فردا لأن كثرة الطرق تقوي. Is that okay? Do we need a break now? It's 11:45. When was the last break that we had?
12:45.
Oh, it's 12:45. Sorry, yeah.
1 o'clock.
We break 1 o'clock. Yeah. Are the students still with me? Are you still with me? It's a technical discussion. Yeah. Hasan Sahih, not Sahih. Hasan Sahih.
Before we said that the hadith is the matn of the hadith is judged according to the strongest isnad.
Yeah.
So in this particular example, it would be Sahih hadith. But so this Hasan Sahih example just for that one.
Yeah. So this is yeah. So I did mention that the strongest isnad is the one according to which the hadith itself takes a hukum. So this hadith is actually a Sahih hadith. There is no reason to basically call it Hasan Sahih. Okay, and yet Imam Tirmizi does do that throughout the entire Sunan al-Tirmizi. He says has a hadithun hasanun sahih, has a hadithun hasanun gharib, has a hadithun sahihun gharib. He has this compound terminology. So what Ibn Hajar is doing is, what do we make of these compound terminologies? Okay, we can basically argue, till kingdom comes, this hadith is sahih, but then what do we do with At-Tirmidhi? Because his entire book, he's having these compound terminologies. So we're trying to make sense of these compound terminologies, especially, with the terminology of Hasan Sahih, because you can't have a hadith Hasan and Sahih at the same time, because Hasan falls below Sahih. So what Ibn Hajar is doing is trying to explain that discrepancy or that contradiction, and he's saying, if the hadith is gharib, so to use your word, if the hadith is gharib, it has only one strand of isnad, then Hasan Sahih will mean that one or some of the narrators in that particular isnad, there is a doubt whether he's Sahih or not. And to express that doubt, At-Tirmizi is basically saying Hasanun Sahih, i.e. Hasanun aw Sahihun. And then that gharib isnad, right, then is lower than a hadith where everybody is Sahih. So Sahih, Hasanun Sahih, and Hasan. But if that hadith Hasanun Sahih has more than one isnad strands, then we will say some strands are Sahih and some strands are Hasan. And Imam Tirmizi is drawing our attention to that fact, that some isnads are Sahih and some isnads are Hasan. Remember, he doesn't give all the isnads. At-Tirmizi won't give you, he'll just give you his isnad, one isnad. He won't give you 2 or 3 isnad. He does sometimes, he'll bring a hadith straight after that, he'll give another isnad. Sometimes, but that's seldom, right? But by saying Hasanun Sahih, what Imam At-Tirmizi is doing is drawing our attention to the fact that this hadith is not only Sahih, but also Hasan, but it's more Sahih because it's got Hasan and Sahih and all of these consolidating and fortifying each other. That's all. So he's trying to explain these contradictory terminologies of Imam Tirmizi. The scholars have their own idiosyncrasies, they all have their own subjectivities, but because Tirmizi is such a pivotal book, they've decided to discuss At-Tirmizi. Does that answer your question, sister? Okay. فَإِنْ قِيلَ there's another i'tiraz, there's another question. قَدْ صَرَّحَ الترمذي بأن شرط الحسن أن يروى من غير وجه فكيف يقول في بعض الأحاديث حسن غريب لا نعرفه إلا من هذا الوجه. Yeah. If it is said that Imam At-Tirmidhi has said قد صرح الترمذي, had clearly said that the shart of the Hasan is ayurwa min ghayri wajhin, that the Hasan hadith has to have more than yurwa, min ghayri wajhin, he has to have more than one wajh. By wajh he means tariqah. فكيف يقول في بعض الأحاديث, how can he say in some ahadith حسن غريب لا نعرفه إلا من هذا الوجه, that this hadith is Hasan Gharib and we don't know any other turuqs for that hadith. Let me give you an example. So Imam al-Tirmidhi basically said Hadith Hasan Gharib number 9. Let me just give you an example. This is getting a bit difficult for everyone. Okay. Imam al-Tirmidhi in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi he says عن جابر بن عبد الله رضي الله تعالى عنه قال نهى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن نستقبل القبلة ببول فرأيته قبل أن يقبض بعام يستقبلها. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade us from looking or facing the Qibla while urinating. However, I saw the Prophet ﷺ urinating facing the Qibla a year before he died. So remember the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تستقبلوا القبلة ولا تستدبروها ببول وغائط. That when you use the toilet, you're not allowed to face the Qibla or you're not allowed to give your backside to the Qibla. Okay? One of the things about Sunan al-Tirmidhi is, Tirmidhi will give you hadith. Prophet ﷺ said, you can't do this. And then he'll give you another chapter, Babu ma ja'a fi rukhsa fi zalika, right? Where the Prophet ﷺ allowed us to do this. So the hadith before that, said the Prophet ﷺ said, don't face the Qibla while using the toilet and don't face away from it. Okay, but here Babu ma ja'a fi rukhsa, the Jabir ibn Abdullah says, Nahan Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam an nastaqbil al-qiblati bi bawlin fara'aytu qabla an yuqbata bi 'amin yastaqbiluha, that I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do this, face the Qibla while urinating 1 year before he died. Imam Tirmidhi says, Hadithu Jabirin fi hadha al-babi hadithun hasanun gharibun. The hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah on this topic is a Hasan Gharib hadith. Yep. Now, in order to understand, let's go back to what Ibn Hajar says. فَإِنْ قِيلَ, if it is said, قَدْ صَرَّحَ التِّرْمِذِي, Imam Tirmidhi clearly has said, بأن شرط الحسن, that the condition of a Hasan hadith is يروى من غير وجه, that the hadith has to be narrated from more than one isnad. فكيف يقول في بعض الأحاديث حسن غريب, how is it possible that Imam at-Tirmidhi says in some hadith that حسن غريب لا نعرف إلا من هذا الوجه, that this hadith is Hasan Gharib, we don't know of any other path other than this. In order to really appreciate what Ibn Hajar is talking about, let's look at what Imam at-Tirmidhi says about Hasan. So we've already discussed that Hasan hadith is ma khaffa dabtuhu, that when the narrator falls below the narrator of the Sahih narrator. Imam at-Tirmidhi says in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, so the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, at the end of the Sunan al-Tirmidhi, there is an appendix. And this appendix is known as Kitabul Ilal al-Saghir. Kitabul Ilal al-Saghir. Like Imam Muslim, right? He has a muqaddimah, a prefix to his Muslim called Muqaddama Sahih Muslim. And in there he talks about his methodology. Imam Tirmidhi has his methodology right at the end. In there he talks about his methodology. Imam Abu Dawood has a risala ila Ahli Makkah. In there he has his methodology. So this is Kitabul Ilal al-Saghir. It's right at the end. And in there Imam Tirmizi discusses a number of things. He discusses is the most sahih isnad he has, the hasan isnad that he has, the da'if isnad. When he quotes Imam Shafi'i, who does he quote from? When he quotes Abu Hanifa, who does he mentions Abu Hanifa twice, by the way. In the normally he says Ashabu Kufa, but he mentions him twice. In the Sunan al-Tirmizi, Imam Tirmizi also has two hadiths where he says that I am very proud to say that Imam Bukhari heard these hadiths from me. Yeah, and in there he also talks about his sources, where he, his sources on ilal and his sources on rijal, where he takes his sources from. So he says, I take it from my teachers. He says, I take it from my teachers, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, Abu Hatim al-Razi, Abu Ishaq al-Razi. He says, from these three, I take most of it from al-Bukhari. And he says that I can confess, and he says, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I confess that in the whole of Central Asia, in Khurasan, in Balkh, in Samarkand, in the whole area where he was, he says, I can confess that by Allah, I have never seen anyone much more knowledgeable in hadith than Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. Right? He confesses that in his book, right? And then look at the beauty of this muhaddithun. Imam Bukhari, right, in one of his mu'allafat, one of his books, he basically says that I have learned more from Abu Isa at-Tirmizi than Abu Isa at-Tirmizi has learnt from me. Yeah. So Imam Bukhari says, I have learnt more from Tirmizi than Tirmizi has learnt from me because of the questioning. Imam Tirmizi used to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? There's a hadith in Sunan al-Tirmizi, right at the beginning, Babu Istinja bil Hajarain. Imam al-Tirmizi takes Imam al-Bukhari to task. And he says, this hadith Bukhari mentions it, but I think it's weak. Right? So I think it's weak. So during my PhD years, when I was looking into this hadith, I looked at all of the different commentaries on Imam at-Tirmizi, and every single one of them basically said at-Tirmizi got it wrong. Yeah, Ibn Hajar, Sayyid al-Nas al-Ya'muri, Imam Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, Abdullah ibn Mubarak Puri, all of the commentaries of Sunan al-Tirmizi, they said that Tirmizi got it wrong. Bukhari actually got it right. But that still didn't, there wasn't tashaffi. So, well, at-Tirmizi wasn't stupid. And he knew that Bukhari wasn't stupid. And he knew that Bukhari was much more better than him hadith. And yet he basically says Bukhari got it wrong. So there must be something that he must have found something. So I couldn't find an answer to it. So I asked Sheikh Akram Nadawi. I said, Sheikh, look, I'm having problems with this because he's a muhaddith, Sheikh Akram Nadawi. So I said, Sheikh, look, I'm finding, I can't find an answer to this. Yeah, I know that, yes, okay, everybody says Tirmizi got it wrong and Bukhari is right, but I want to know what is it, what point that Imam Tirmizi felt in himself that he was right, that Bukhari was wrong. Imam Tirmizi must have felt that and he basically said, look, some of these, he gave a cop out at this, some of these questions take a lifetime to answer, right? Keep looking and tell me the answer. So I haven't, later on I just found the answer to that. It's just that in that particular issue, two of Imam Tirmizi's teachers had an ikhtilaf. Abu Hatim al-Razi declared Israel from Abu Ishaq to be stronger, and Imam Bukhari declared Yunus from Israel to be stronger, right? And Imam Tirmizi just felt that Abu Hatim al-Razi is correct in this and not Bukhari, and that's all it was. It was just basically an opinion of two teachers about one particular rawi, Israel. Bukhari felt that Yunus narrates from Abu Ishaq. Israel, the first isnad that I gave you, Yunus narrates from Abu Ishaq. Israel narrates from Abu Ishaq. Imam Bukhari just felt that Yunus is a stronger narrator when he's narrating from Abu Ishaq. Abu Hatim al-Razi felt that Israel, who is the son of Abu Ishaq, is a stronger narrator. Okay, Imam al-Tirmizi just felt that Abu Hatim al-Razi was right here and Imam Bukhari was not correct. That's all it was. He just preferred one teacher over the other. But anyway, Imam al-Tirmizi, at the end of the Sunan al-Tirmizi, he has his methodology, and in there he has a whole section on ghiba, which is very interesting. Is it permissible to do ghiba? Yeah, ghiba, backbiting. There's a whole discussion on whether it's permissible to do backbiting. Why do you think that discussion is in the book of Ilal al-Saghir, or in a hadith book? Yeah. You know, Yahya ibn Ma'in says he might be my dad, but he's da'if, right? You know, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, right? Who's the Sirah of Muhammad ibn Ishaq. Imam Malik says, Dajjalu min ad-Dajajila. Come on, you want to call somebody weak, call him weak, but don't call him Dajjal, right? So in there's a whole section on is it permissible to do ghibat. So there's a very interesting anecdote that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Tirmizi quotes. Ahmad ibn Hanbal says to Yahya ibn Ma'in, Ta'al naghtabu sa'atan fi sabilillah. Right? Come, let's do ghibat in the way of Allah for an hour. Yeah, meaning that let's do jarh ta'dil. So there was a genuine kind of concern, especially from the Sufis, right? They attacked the hadith scholars and said, you know, you hadith scholars, you got no iman. You know, you're always doing ghibat of people. You're calling that person Dajjal and you're calling that person weak. And, you know, there's a narrator by the name of Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi. His name is Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi. Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi is the narrator. The Hanafis use him for the hadith. You know, when a companion came to the masjid and there was some work going in the Masjid Nabawi, and there was a kind of a ditch, and the companion fell in, right? And all the little younger Sahabas, they saw him and they started giggling, and the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever laughed, go and do wudu. And that's the Hanafi dalil for your wudu breaks if you laugh in prayer. Imam, you know, Shafi'i says Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi, he declares him weak, but he doesn't say da'if. He didn't say da'if. Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi da'if. He says Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi kar-riyah. Right? Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi is like the riyah. It's like the wind. So that can be, you know, declared as ghiba by some people. You know, come on, okay, you're making fun of his name, right? So that's why the muhaddithun had to kind of, you know, cover their backs and discuss this. Imam al-Tirmizi, he discusses this topic of, you know, ghiba. So they discuss all of these kind of different topics. So one of the things that he discusses is this hadith terminologies that he uses. So it's 1 o'clock. Let's take a break for 10 minutes, and then when do we pray Dhuhr?
Dhuhr at 1:45.
Okay.
So we could push to.
What time does Asr start?
We could do lunch break if you want to.
Now? Do you want to do? I don't know. It's up to you.
Let's do a lunch break.
Let's do one lunch break.
And then Dhuhr, and then we'll continue.
Okay. So what time do we come back at 2 o'clock?
2 o'clock.
Inshallah. कोई बात नहीं. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, inshallah, I'll see you after lunch. You guys providing lunch? Or sorry, I have to ask. I think it's stop recording.
That's gonna go.
No, stop. I think it's coronavirus. That's what they can't provide.
It's up here.
The other day I went to Florida Chicken and I told them to cut the chicken.